Montana Territory, autumn 1889. Raymond Carlisle was a 41-year-old former copper miner who'd spent 16 years working the Anaconda tunnels, 1,000 feet below the surface. He couldn't shake what he'd learned underground, that temperature stabilizes with depth, that the earth itself holds steady while the surface world swings between extremes. That September, while his neighbors were chinkling their log cabins and stacking cordwood for the coming cold, Raymond started digging beneath his barn floor. "You're wasting your time, Carlisle," Jonas Weatherby told him. Weatherby was the valley's master builder, a man who'd raised 43 structures in his 32 years of frontier work. "Dirt don't keep you warm. You'll suffocate your family down there." Cinematic historical documentary photography, 1889 Montana Territory frontier homestead, barn with open trapdoors showing excavation beneath. Middle-aged man in dark mining clothes, holding shovel, being confronted by well-dressed builder in fine coat. Other settlers watching from split-rail fence, pine forest, and distant mountains. Autumn light. Snow beginning on peaks. Film grain texture. Documentary realism. Fictional settlers. Faces not identifiable. No resemblance to any real person or public figure. Wide shot. The question wasn't whether it looked ridiculous. Everyone agreed it did. A grown man digging a hole under his barn like some kind of animal burrowing for winter. The problem wasn't the digging. It was the wind. Raymond had a wife, Catherine, 38 years old, and 2 children. Margaret, age 9, and Thomas, age 6. They'd been in the valley 3 years, and every winter had been the same story. Brutal cold, constant drafts. Wood burned faster than they could split it. The children slept in wool coats. Catherine stuffed rags in every crack she could find. And still the wind found its way through. The Ketchum family, just 2 miles south, had lost their youngest child the previous February. 4 years old. They'd found her in the morning, frozen in her bed. The cabin had run out of wood during the night, and the father had been too exhausted to make another trip to the woodpile in the dark. Raymond wasn't going to let that happen to his family. He'd worked the deep tunnels long enough to know something most surface dwellers never learned. 8 feet down, the earth temperature stays constant. Summer or winter, it holds at around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but stable. Predictable. And in winter, when surface temperatures dropped to 30 or 40 below zero, that 50-degree earth became something like mercy. The conventional wisdom in the valley was simple. Build a tight log cabin, install a large fireplace or cast iron stove, stack as much wood as you can possibly cut, and burn it all winter long. The wealthier families had brick chimneys. The poorer families made do with stone. Everyone understood that winter meant smoke, meant constant fire tending, meant children taking shifts through the night to keep the stove fed. Raymond had done that for 3 years. He'd burned cord after cord. He'd woken every 2 hours to add wood. He'd watched his children's breath frost in the air 6 feet from a roaring fire. And he'd thought about those tunnel walls, how they stayed the same temperature day after day, year after year, no matter what hell the surface world was going through. So he started digging. The excavation went down 8 feet beneath the barn floor. He dug it 12 feet wide and 16 feet long. The walls were fieldstone, laid dry without mortar, because mortar would crack in the freeze-thaw cycle. The ceiling was heavy timber beams, covered with planks, covered with earth. 3 feet of earth above the planks, compacted solid. Access was through a trapdoor in the barn floor, with a ladder descending straight down. He used stones from the creek bed, each one chosen for how it fit against its neighbors. The walls went up slowly. He worked alone most days, though Catherine came down the ladder sometimes to hand him stones or hold the lantern while he mortared the floor. She didn't argue with him. She'd seen what winter did. She'd heard Margaret coughing in the night, heard Thomas crying that his feet hurt from the cold. The skepticism in the valley wasn't quiet. "He's building a tomb," one neighbor said at the general store. "They'll go down there and never come up. Air won't circulate," another man added. "They'll suffocate or freeze, one or the other." Jonas Weatherby, the master builder, made his opinion clear to anyone who'd listen. "I've built for 3 decades, he said. "Never seen anything like it. Man's got no sense. You need heat rising, smoke venting, air moving. Bury yourself in dirt and you'll die." The women worried about Catherine. "How can she let him do this?" they whispered. Those poor children. But Catherine had made her choice. She'd married a miner, and miners understood earth in ways surface folk didn't. If Raymond said it would work, she believed him. By mid-November, the underground room was finished. Raymond installed a small cast-iron stove in one corner, with a stovepipe running up through the barn floor and out through the barn roof. The pipe was double-walled where it passed through the timber ceiling, packed with sand for fire safety. He built sleeping platforms along 2 walls, raised off the stone floor. He brought down their winter supplies: potatoes, turnips, dried beans, salt pork, flour. The entrance remained the ladder through the barn floor. In severe weather, they could close the trapdoor completely and still have air circulation through the stovepipe. In moderate cold, they left it open for easier access. The total cost of materials: approximately $8 for the stovepipe, $3 for the cast-iron stove purchased used from a family leaving the territory, and whatever value you placed on Raymond's labor. The stones cost nothing. The timber came from their own land. The sleeping platforms were made from barn lumber. Jonas Weatherby heard about the stove installation and shook his head. "Stove that's small won't heat anything," he said. "And that pipe's going to backdraft. Smoke'll kill them if the cold doesn't." The family moved into the underground room on November 28, 1889. The first night, Catherine lay awake, listening to the silence. No wind howling through chinking. No drafts across the floor. No creaking logs contracting in the cold. Just stillness and the soft sound of her children breathing without coughing. The temperature in the room, measured by Raymond's mercury thermometer, was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove wasn't even lit yet. Outside, the surface temperature that night was 31 degrees. Raymond lit the stove the next morning, more for light and cooking than for heat. He used small pieces of wood, letting the fire burn hot, but brief. Within an hour, the room temperature had risen to 62 degrees. He let the fire die down. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 58 degrees. They burned, on average, 1/5 the wood their neighbors used. December came cold. The surface temperatures dropped into the teens, then the single digits. Raymond's neighbors burned wood constantly. Their cabins filled with smoke because they couldn't let the fires die down even for a moment. Children slept in layers of clothing. Families huddled close to stoves, leaving the far corners of their cabins to freeze. In the underground room, the Carlyle family wore normal indoor clothing. Margaret and Thomas played on the floor without shivering. Catherine cooked without needing a shawl over her shoulders. The stone walls radiated a gentle, steady coolness, but the air itself stayed comfortable. The neighbors noticed the smoke, or rather, the lack of it. The Carlyle barn showed only occasional wisps from the stovepipe, while every other chimney in the valley poured thick columns into the winter sky. "They must be freezing," one woman said. "Maybe they're burning coal," another suggested. "Or maybe they're dead, and nobody knows yet," a third added darkly. Jonas Weatherby made it his business to check on them. He arrived at the barn on December 15th, a day when the outside temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. He'd walked the quarter-mile from his own place, and his beard was white with frost. Raymond met him at the barn door. "Come to see if we're still alive?" Raymond asked. "Something like that," Weatherby admitted. "Folks are talking, saying you're either dead or crazy." "We're neither," Raymond said. "Come down and see for yourself." Weatherby hesitated. He'd built his reputation on knowing what worked and what didn't. Going down that ladder felt like admitting he might have been wrong. But curiosity won. He followed Raymond to the trapdoor. The first thing Weatherby noticed was the warmth. It rolled up through the trapdoor, opening like something physical. He descended the ladder, and with each rung, the temperature increased. By the time his feet touched the stone floor, he was sweating inside his heavy coat. Catherine was mending a shirt at the table. The children were reading by lantern light. Nobody wore a coat. Nobody shivered. The air was still, slightly humid from cooking and breathing, but fresh enough. The stove in the corner held only a few glowing coals, barely a fire at all. Weatherby pulled out his own thermometer. He'd brought it specifically to prove Raymond wrong. He hung it on a nail in the wall and waited. After 5 minutes, he checked it. 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 4 degrees above zero. Weatherby stood there for a long moment, looking at that thermometer. Then he looked at the walls, the ceiling, the small stove. He did calculations in his head. He'd built enough fireplaces and chimneys to know how much heat a stove that size could produce, how much wood it would take to maintain 68 degrees in a conventional cabin on a 4-degree day. "How much wood are you burning?" he asked. "Maybe a quarter of what I used to," Raymond said. "Some days less." Weatherby walked to the wall and placed his palm against the stone. It was cool to the touch, but not cold, not frozen, just cool, like a cellar in summer. "The Earth's doing most of the work," Raymond explained. 8 feet down, it's always around 52 or 53 degrees. The stone walls are in contact with that stable temperature. They're not losing heat to frozen air like a surface wall does. So the stove doesn't have to fight the cold. It just has to add 15 or 20 degrees to what the Earth's already giving us. Weatherby nodded slowly. He understood insulation, understood heat loss, understood thermal mass. He just never thought about the Earth itself as part of the heating system. "And the air?" he asked. "How does it stay fresh?" "Stovepipe," Raymond said. "Same as any cabin. Draws air up and out. Cold air comes in through the cracks around the trapdoor, warms up, rises to the ceiling, exits through the pipe. It's a slow exchange, but it's enough." Weatherby stayed for 20 minutes. He asked questions. He examined the stonework, the timber ceiling, the stove installation. He checked for condensation on the walls and found only slight dampness in the corners, easily managed with occasional air circulation. He looked at the sleeping platforms, the food storage, the simple domestic arrangements. Finally, he climbed back up the ladder. At the top, he turned to Raymond. "I was wrong," he said. "I'll tell anyone who asks. This works." He walked home in the freezing afternoon, thinking about every cabin he'd built, every family he'd advised, every time he'd said that the old ways were the only ways. He'd been wrong about something fundamental. The earth wasn't just dirt. It was stability. It was a heat source that never went out. Word spread quietly at first. Weatherby didn't announce his change of mind publicly, but he stopped criticizing Raymond's shelter. And when people asked him directly, he told them what he'd seen. By Christmas, 3 families had approached Raymond asking questions. By New Year, 2 more. They wanted measurements. They wanted to know about stone selection, ceiling construction, stovepipe installation. They wanted to know if it would work for them. Raymond shared everything he knew. He walked them through the physics, the construction steps, the material costs. He showed them his family's wood consumption compared to what they'd used in previous winters. The numbers didn't lie. Then January arrived, and January that year was brutal. The temperature dropped on January 19th and didn't rise again for 12 days. The mercury fell to 14 degrees below zero, then 18 below, then 21 below. Wind came down from the mountains in waves that shook cabin walls and pried at chinking. Snow drifted 6 feet deep against north-facing walls. Families burned through their wood piles at terrifying rates. The Hendrickson cabin, a mile east, ran out of wood on the 4th day of the cold snap. They burned their furniture. They burned fence posts. They huddled together under every blanket they owned, and still the cold found them. The father made a desperate trip to Raymond's place, stumbling through drifts in the dark, begging for help. Raymond gave him what wood he could spare and invited the family to share the underground room. The Hendricksons came that night, all 5 of them, and descended into warmth that felt like a miracle. The underground shelter held 65 degrees throughout the 12-day freeze. Raymond kept the stove burning steadily, but not heavily. The stone walls radiated their stable coolness. The earth above and around them held its constant temperature. The family slept in shifts on the platforms, cooked simple meals, waited for the weather to break. Above ground, it was 21 degrees below zero. Below ground, children played without coats. The Hendricksons stayed for 8 days, until the temperature finally rose above zero and they could return to their cabin. When they left, the father shook Raymond's hand for a long time without speaking. His wife kissed Catherine's cheek. The children didn't want to go back up the ladder into the cold. By February, the valley had changed its mind about Raymond Carlisle's dirt trap. 7 families began excavations that spring. Jonas Weatherby, the master builder who'd called it foolish, became Raymond's most vocal advocate. He helped design the shelters, calculated timber loads, advised on stone selection. He taught other builders what he'd learned. He admitted, publicly, that he'd been wrong. The shelters weren't identical. Some families dug under their barns, like Raymond. Others excavated into hillsides, using the slope for easier access. One family built theirs beneath their cabin floor, with a trapdoor in the main room. Each variation taught something new about air circulation, about moisture management, about the balance between earth temperature and stove heat. The pattern was consistent. Every family that moved underground cut their wood consumption dramatically. 60 to 70% reductions were common. The children stopped coughing through the night. The women stopped waking every 2 hours to tend the fire. The men stopped losing sleep over whether they'd cut enough wood to last the winter. The following winter was milder, but still tested them. The underground shelters performed exactly as expected. Stable temperatures, minimal fuel use, comfortable living spaces. The skepticism faded. The mockery stopped. The technique became simply another option, another way to survive the frontier winter. Raymond's children grew up warm. Margaret, the 9-year-old who'd spent her first 3 Montana winters sleeping in a coat, became a teacher. She told her students about the winter her father dug into the earth and found warmth that never died. Thomas, a 6-year-old boy who'd cried about his frozen feet, became a builder himself. He excavated underground rooms for 12 families over his career, each one slightly improved from the last. Catherine lived to see her grandchildren, and every one of them was born in a warm house. She never forgot those first nights underground, listening to her children breathe without coughing, watching them play without shivering. It had seemed like madness when Raymond started digging. It had proven to be wisdom. Jonas Weatherby, the master builder who'd called it a tomb, lived another 23 years. He built conventional cabins when clients wanted them, but he always asked if they'd considered going underground. He taught the principles to younger builders. He wrote detailed instructions that circulated through the territory. He never stopped regretting that he'd dismissed the idea so quickly, that he'd let pride blind him to physics. The technique spread slowly through Montana and Wyoming territories. It never became common, because most people still preferred surface structures. But it persisted in pockets, in valleys where winter hit hardest, in families who valued warmth over convention. Each underground shelter became a small rebellion against the assumption that frontier life had to mean constant cold, constant fire tending, constant fear that the wood would run out. The shelters were typically abandoned within 1 or 2 generations. As modern heating systems arrived, as coal became widely available, as insulation technology improved, the need for earth-sheltered spaces diminished. Most families filled in the excavations, or converted them back to root cellars. The knowledge faded into local history, preserved mostly in old letters and occasional newspaper accounts. By the 1920s, rural electrification was beginning to reach some areas. By the 1940s, propane and oil heating had made earth-sheltered living unnecessary for most families. The old underground rooms became storage spaces, forgotten spaces, eventually filled-in spaces. But the principle remained true. 8 feet down, the earth stays at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer. That stability never changed. The physics didn't care whether anyone remembered them. Raymond Carlisle died in 1923, at age 75. He'd lived 34 winters in Montana, and for 33 of them, he'd slept warm. His obituary mentioned his mining career, his family, his years in the valley. It didn't mention the shelter. By then, it seemed unremarkable. Just another old-timer's story about the hard early days. But 7 families had survived brutal winters because he'd remembered what he'd learned in the tunnels. Dozens of children had grown up without frostbite, without constant coughing, without the fear of waking to a dead fire. Hundreds of cords of wood had stayed standing in the forest instead of burning in desperate, inefficient fires. The shelter under Raymond's barn remained functional until 1947, when his grandson finally filled it in. By then, the house had electric heat. The barn was scheduled for demolition. Nobody needed an underground room anymore. The excavation was filled with earth and stones, and the barn floor was patched solid. Within a year, nothing visible remained to show what had been there. The knowledge survived longer in some places than others. A few families in the Wind River Range of Wyoming kept their earth-sheltered rooms operational into the 1950s, using them as storm shelters and cold storage. In northern Minnesota, one family maintained their hillside excavation until 1962, though by then they used it mostly for keeping vegetables through the winter. The last known functional underground winter shelter in Montana, built in 1891 using Raymond's design principles, was sealed in 1958. The family who'd lived in it for 2 generations had moved to town. The property was sold to a rancher who had no use for the space. He filled it in, plowed over it, and within 5 years, even the location was uncertain. What remains now are documents. Letters from homesteaders describing the shelters. Building notes passed between families. Occasional mentions in territorial newspapers. A few photographs showing barn floors with trapdoors, though the underground spaces themselves were too dark for the cameras of that era to capture clearly. And the physics remains. The Earth still holds its temperature at depth. Thermal mass still stores and radiates heat. Dead air spaces still insulate. The principles that kept the Carlisle family warm in 1889 would work identically today, if anyone chose to apply them. Modern building codes would require different construction methods: engineered support beams instead of rough-cut timber, mechanical ventilation instead of natural draft, emergency egress beyond a single ladder. The materials would change. The scale might change. But the fundamental relationship between earth temperature, insulation, and minimal heat input would remain exactly the same. Before undertaking any underground construction, or any project that deviates from standard residential building practices, consult with licensed structural engineers, building code officials, and safety inspectors. Historical techniques, no matter how effective in their time, must be adapted to meet current safety standards, engineering requirements, and legal regulations. This account is historical education, not construction advice. The story of Raymond Carlisle and his earth-sheltered winter room exists now as a small footnote in frontier history, preserved mostly in family records and historical society archives. It's not taught in engineering schools. It doesn't appear in textbooks about frontier survival. Most people who live in the Montana valleys today have never heard of it. But for 12 days in January 1890, when the temperature dropped to 21 degrees below zero, and the wind tried to tear the world apart, that underground room kept 2 families safe and warm. While neighbors burned their furniture and prayed for the weather to break, children played on a stone floor 8 feet underground, comfortable in their shirt sleeves, reading by lantern light in 65-degree stillness. That's not legend. That's not exaggeration. That's physics applied by a man who'd spent enough time underground to understand what the earth could offer. And for a few decades, in a handful of valleys across the Northern Territories, families remembered that lesson and stayed warm because of it. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more forgotten frontier survival innovations that actually worked. The mathematics were straightforward. Outside temperature 21 degrees below zero. Inside temperature 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Difference of 89 degrees maintained with 1/5 the firewood of a conventional cabin. The stone walls stayed at approximately 53 degrees. The Earth's constant contribution and the small stove added only the final 15 degrees needed for comfort. Jonas Weatherby calculated it once, trying to understand what he'd missed. A conventional log cabin in that cold would lose heat through every surface. Walls, roof, floor, windows, door, every chink and gap. The heat fought its way out through multiple paths, and the stove had to replace it constantly. The underground shelter lost heat through only one surface, the ceiling. The walls and floor weren't losing heat. They were stable at earth temperature. The stove wasn't fighting a 90-degree battle. It was supplementing a 50-degree baseline. It was simple. It was obvious, once you understood it. And it had taken a former copper miner to teach it to a master builder with 30 years of experience. The valley built 7 earth-sheltered rooms in the spring of 1890. By 1895, that number had grown to 18. By 1900, it had peaked at 23. Then began to decline as modern heating technology spread. Each shelter represented a family that had chosen warmth over convention, physics over tradition. Each one was a small victory against the frontier cold. And each one was eventually abandoned, filled in, forgotten. Catherine Carlyle died in 1931, at age 80. In her later years, living in a conventional house with a coal furnace, she sometimes told her grandchildren about the winters underground. They listened politely, but they didn't really understand. They'd never been cold like that. They'd never burned furniture to stay alive. They'd never felt what it meant to descend a ladder into warmth that wouldn't die. Margaret, the eldest daughter, kept her father's mercury thermometer until she died in 1967. It was a simple instrument, mercury in glass, marked in degrees Fahrenheit. She'd watched him check it every morning for years, recording the temperature of the underground room. 52 degrees before the fire, 63 degrees with the fire burning, 58 degrees when the stove ran hot. The numbers never lied. She donated the thermometer to the County Historical Society in 1964. It sits now in a drawer with other frontier artifacts, surveying tools, mining equipment, hand-forged nails. Nobody looking at it would know what it measured, what survival depended on its accuracy, what warmth it witnessed. Thomas Carlyle, the younger child, who'd been 6 years old that first winter underground, built his last earth-sheltered room in 1919. The family who commissioned it was Norwegian, recently arrived, struggling with their first Montana winter. They'd heard the old stories. They wanted what Raymond Carlyle had built 30 years earlier. Thomas gave them everything his father had taught him: the 8-foot depth, the fieldstone walls, the timber ceiling with earth above, the small, efficient stove. He added improvements learned over decades: better drainage systems, clay pipes for controlled ventilation, a second emergency exit through a side tunnel. The shelter worked exactly as designed. By 1925, that family had installed a coal furnace in their main house. The underground room became a root cellar. By 1933, it was rarely used. By 1940, the entrance was boarded over. By 1952, when the property changed hands, the new owners didn't even know it existed until they noticed a depression in the ground during a heavy rain. The pattern repeated across the territory. Knowledge that had saved lives became unnecessary, then forgotten, then lost. The Wind River shelters in Wyoming lasted longer, partly because the winters there remained brutal, even as technology advanced. The last family to use their earth-sheltered room for actual winter living did so through the winter of 1961 and 1962. They were elderly, the husband and wife both in their 70s, living on a remote homestead where power lines hadn't reached. They descended the ladder every November and emerged every March, just as families had done 70 years earlier. The husband died in 1963. The wife moved to town. The shelter was sealed in 1964. In northern Minnesota, the Koivisto family maintained their hillside excavation until 1962, though they'd added electric lighting and a small electric heater by the 1950s. They used it primarily for cold storage by then, but in severe storms, they'd still move down there for the stable temperature and protection from wind. When they finally sealed the entrance, the father told his son, "We don't need it anymore, but your great-grandfather would be sad to see it go." The son nodded. He'd grown up hearing stories about winters when the shelter meant survival. But he'd also grown up with central heating and insulated walls and weather forecasts on television. The stories felt distant, almost mythical. He couldn't quite believe that his family had once lived underground for months at a time. Within a generation, even the location was uncertain. Within 2 generations, it was forgotten entirely. The physics textbooks don't mention Raymond Carlisle. The engineering courses don't teach earth-sheltered passive heating as frontier survival technique. The historical markers along Montana highways note mining camps and cavalry forts and railroad depots, but not the scattered underground rooms where families stayed warm with 1/5 the firewood their neighbors required. The knowledge exists now primarily in fragments. A letter here, a diary entry there, an occasional newspaper mention, a few photographs of barn floors with trapdoors. Historians who specialize in frontier domestic life sometimes encounter references to underground winter rooms or earth cellars used for living, but the details are sparse. Most of the families who built them left no written records. Most of the shelters were filled in and forgotten before anyone thought to document them systematically. What we know for certain is this: the technique worked. The physics was sound. The fuel savings were dramatic. The comfort improvement was significant. And within 70 years, it had almost entirely vanished from cultural memory. Modern earth-sheltered architecture exists, of course. Passive solar design incorporates similar principles. Geothermal heating uses the Earth's stable temperature. But these modern systems are engineered, calculated, regulated, completely different in implementation from what Raymond Carlisle dug beneath his barn floor in 1889. The frontier version was simpler, rougher, more dependent on understanding basic principles than on complex engineering. And it was proven in the hardest possible laboratory: actual survival through actual winter, at actual 21 degrees below zero, with children's lives depending on whether the physics worked or whether the skeptics were right. The skeptics were wrong. The mockery was misplaced. The dirt trap kept families alive. Jonas Weatherby understood that, eventually. He spent years trying to make up for his initial dismissal, teaching what he'd learned, helping families build their own earth-sheltered spaces. But he never quite forgave himself for being so certain he was right when he was actually wrong. He'd seen the thermometer reading. He'd felt the stable warmth. He'd done the mathematics. And he'd had to admit that a copper miner understood something fundamental that a master builder had missed. That humility, that willingness to learn from unexpected sources, might be the real lesson. Raymond Carlisle wasn't educated in architecture or engineering. He was a working man who'd paid attention in the tunnels, who'd remembered what the earth could do. who'd been willing to look foolish in order to keep his family warm. And for a few decades, in a few valleys, other families learned from him. They dug their own shelters. They survived their own winters. They passed the knowledge to their children, who eventually didn't need it, who eventually forgot it, who eventually couldn't quite believe it had ever been necessary. The last person who actually lived through a winter in an earth-sheltered room built on Raymond Carlisle's principles died in 1998 in a nursing home in Billings. She'd been 7 years old in 1919, living in that Norwegian family's shelter that Thomas Carlyle had built. She remembered the stone walls. She remembered the ladder. She remembered being warm while the wind screamed above ground. She remembered her mother saying, "This is how the Carlyle family survived. This is how we'll survive." Nobody interviewed her about it. Nobody recorded her memories. It was just part of her childhood, part of the old days, part of a world that had disappeared so completely that her grandchildren couldn't quite picture it. The earth still holds its temperature at 52 degrees, 8 feet down. That never changed. The physics still works. The principle is still sound. The knowledge is still there, waiting in old letters and forgotten diary entries and occasional historical society archives, waiting for anyone curious enough to look, patient enough to read, willing enough to learn from people who've been dead for a century. Raymond Carlisle's barn stood until 1952, when it finally collapsed during a spring storm. The timbers were salvaged for other projects. The site was cleared. Within 10 years, grass had grown over where the underground shelter had been. Within 20 years, nobody could locate it precisely without survey records. But on winter nights, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind comes down from the mountains, the earth 8 feet down stays at 52 degrees. Stable. Constant. Offering the same shelter it offered in 1889, whether anyone remembers to use it or not. The end.